thing that I know, yes I know, it's all from you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So sing with me, Ein Elohim milvado, Ein Elohim milvado, ay ay ay, Ein Elohim milvado, Efes uloso, oy oy ay 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 I don't know what.
What a great song from Joey Newcomb from his new album Big Avoid Us. This one's called The One Thing That I Know. I don't know why, I don't know how, I don't know where, but I know who. Right? Who does it fall from? HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He. How's everybody doing? Great to be with you on a Monday. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on Labor Day doing some beautiful learning? Pauline in Chicagoland, Melissa in Great Neck, Tom in PA, Stephen in New Hampshire, Renee in Indiana, Yehud in South Carolina, Sandy in Michigan, John in Maine, James in Indianapolis, Laura in Oklahoma, Ira in South Carolina, Franco in Trieste, Italy. Welcome, Franco. Lucy in Minnesota, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bitsy in North Carolina, Paula says shalom, Nancy in North Carolina, Leslie in New Jersey, Martha in Anaheim, Cinna in LA, Bella in Florida, Karen in Northern California, Sam in Central Virginia, Bill in mid-Missouri. Welcome everybody over there on the YouTube side. No one checked in yet. Oh, but Marco checking in from Melbourne in Australia, one of my favorite towns in the world. In case you haven't heard the shofar yet today, let's give a blast. It's Elul. 21 days to go until Rosh Hashanah. Today's daf is a fun one. Page, what is it? Samech Aleph, page 61. Here in Tractate Kesubos, the 15th volume of the Talmud. These are the generally speaking the laws of marriage contracts. We're in chapter 5. Today, concluding our discussion of Mishnah number 4 and opening Mishnah number 5. Mishnah number 4 talked about some of the obligations of a wife under the marriage contract within a Jewish marriage. And this included the question of whether she's obligated to nurse the child or not. Some other tasks that she's obligated to do. However, if it's a very wealthy couple and she brings maidservants into the marriage, then she'll be excused from having to do some of these tasks herself. However, no matter how wealthy they are, no matter how many maidservants she brings into the marriage, there are some tasks that she should still do herself. And then we have a dispute between two of the sages. Both agree that, what's the word I'm looking for? That idleness leads to trouble. But one says idleness leads to licentiousness. The other one says idleness leads to idiocy. Which view do we follow? We'll get to that in a little bit. But where we finished off yesterday in our discussion of Mishnah number 4, we were talking about nursing, and apropos the obligation to nurse or not, we learned kind of incidentally some kind of folk wisdom from the period of the Talmud about certain practices and foods that can have consequences, can have impact both on nursing and on pregnancy. So we continue that discussion now, a couple lines down from the top of page 61a. Rav Huna said that Rav Huna Bar Chanana tested us, right? So one of the sages talking about when he was a student and he was learning, and an older sage tested them. So Rav Huna Bar Chanana tested us by asking if she says, meaning the wife, if she says that she wants to nurse her child, and he, the husband, says that he does not want her to nurse, but rather to give the child to a wet nurse, so we accede to her desires, as she is the one suffering from engorgement of her breasts. If that's what she wants to do, she'll do it, and we don't listen to the husband who tells her not to. However, if the husband says that he wants her to nurse, and she says that she does not want to nurse, well, then what is the law? And our teacher then narrowed the scope of the question. So anywhere that she is not accustomed, as the women of her family generally do not nurse their children, but give them to wet nurses instead, so we accede to her desires. However, if she is accustomed to nursing and he is not accustomed, meaning he comes from a family where the women in his family give the children to wet nurses, right? So she comes from the family where the women nurse. She marries into a family where the women don't. And now she would prefer not to nurse. And the husband says, I want you to nurse. I guess like the women of my family. So then what is the law, right? She comes, right. So she comes from a family where they do the nursing. His family, they don't do the nursing. She doesn't want to nurse, so she wants to do like the women of his family that she's marrying into, but he's telling her, no, I want you to nurse like the women of your family. Then what is the law? Do we follow his wishes that she should follow her family custom and nurse, or do we follow her wishes that she would like to follow her husband's family custom and not nurse? And Rav Huna says, and we answered Rav Huna Bar Chanana's question from this statement of the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, right, the Talmud period. When a woman marries a man, she ascends with him to his socioeconomic status if it is higher than hers. But she does not descend with him if his status is lower. Consequently, if his family is not accustomed to nurse, she is not obligated to nurse either. If she rather not nurse like the women of his family, the family that she is marrying into, she can do it that way. And Rav Huna said, what is the verse from which this is derived? It is derived from Genesis 20, verse 3. She is a man's wife. And the Gemara explains, the word used here for wife, be'ula, hints through similar spelling that she ascends in status with the ascension, an aliyah, of her husband, but she does not descend with the descent of her husband. And Rabbi Elazar said, and there is a hint to this principle from here, Genesis 3:20, speaking about Eve, right, the mother of all humanity, and the line says, literally, as she was the mother of all living, which indicates that she was given to her husband for living with him, but not given to suffer pain with him, right? So a woman who marries a man, if his family is higher a socioeconomic status than what she comes from, so then she can conduct herself like the women of his family. If she marries a man who's lower socioeconomic status than her family, she can continue to act like the family that she came from. She only changes in order to ascend, not to descend. Now the Mishna states that if she, the wife, brought into the marriage one maidservant, she does not need to grind wheat, bake, or wash clothes. This is in Mishnah number 4 here that we're covering now. So the Gemara infers from this statement that she must nevertheless perform the other tasks that are listed in the Mishnah. So the Gemara asks, well, let the wife say to him, hey, I brought you a woman in my place, right? A maidservant, meaning a female slave when slavery was permitted, who can perform all the tasks that I'm supposed to do. And the wife should be completely exempt. So the Gemara answers, well, this is not a valid argument because the husband can say to her, well, this maidservant toils for me and for herself like any other woman, but who will toil for you, the wife? It is necessary for the wife to do some work in order to cover some of her own expenses. So the Mishnah further stated that if the wife brought 2 maidservants into the marriage, then she does not need to cook and she does not need to nurse her child. So the Gemara infers, but she must nevertheless perform the other tasks. So the Gemara says, let the wife say to her husband, I brought you another woman who can toil for me and for herself, and one who can toil for you and for herself. Consequently, I do not need to do any work at all. And the Gemara answers, not a valid argument, because the husband can say to her, well, who is going to toil for the guests and wayfarers who will come because we are a large household? There are still other tasks that need to be performed. You can't just, sit on your chair all day. So the Mishnah further said that if she brought into the marriage 3 maidservants, then she does not need to make his bed or make thread from wool. And the Gemara infers, but she must nevertheless perform the other tasks that are included in that list of obligations of a wife to her husband. And the Gemara asks, well, let her say to him, I brought you another woman to toil for the guests and wayfarers, in addition to the one who toils for herself and for me, and the other one who toils for herself and for you. Therefore, I do not need to do any work at all. And the Gemara answers, this is also not a valid argument, because the husband can say to her, well, when the members of the house increase, the number of guests and wayfarers also increases, and therefore there is still more work to be done. So the Gemara asks, well, if so, then even if she brought him 4 maidservants as well, she should also have to work, as there will be many more guests. But the Mishnah says that if she brought 4 maidservants into the marriage, then she doesn't need to do anything. And the Gemara answers, when there are 4 maidservants working in a household, since there are many of them, they assist one another and they can complete all the necessary tasks. So Rav Chana, and some say Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani, said, right, so if she brings 4 maidservants into the marriage, she can sit on a chair all day long in terms of the idea that the work of the house will get done, even if she doesn't participate, if she only supervises. However, we also learned in the Mishnah that she should not sit on a chair all day long because idleness causes problems. But we're not there yet. So Rav Chana, and some say Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani, said, this does not necessarily mean that she actually brought him maidservants. Rather, once she is able to bring him maidservants, in other words, her dowry is sufficiently large that they could purchase maidservants if they want to, then she is exempt from performing the tasks, even though she may not actually have brought maidservants into the marriage. And the sages taught whether she brought him actual maidservants or whether she reduced her own needs in order to release enough money to bring a maidservant to work, she is exempt from those tasks. The Mishnah says that if she brought him 4 maidservants, she may sit in a chair and not do anything. And Rav Yitzchak bar Hanania said that Rav Huna said, although they said that she may sit in a chair and not need to work, she should still pour his cup and make his bed and wash his face, hands, and feet. Why? Because these responsibilities are not household tasks that can be delegated to a maidservant. Rather, they are gestures of affection toward her husband. The last thing that a wife should want is that any other woman would, perform certain tasks for her husband because they're intimate tasks. It's not necessarily rising to the level of having sex with him, but nevertheless, they're intimate tasks that are the obligations of a wife. She should, happily do for him, just as there are certain intimate things that he should happily do for her, because they might lead to physical intimacy. But even short of that, they're intimate gestures, and that's something for to be, just for the husband and wife between them. And nobody should be doing that stuff for them. Rav Yitzchak bar Hanania also said that Rav Huna said a similar law. All tasks that a wife performs for her husband, a menstruating woman may similarly perform for her husband, except for pouring his cup, making his bed, and washing his face, hands, and feet. As explained above, these are acts of affection. If she is menstruating, she should not perform them. Why? Because it might lead to temptation and intimacy between them. And since she's menstruating, they're not permitted to have physical relations with each other. So during that time of the month, she should not do those tasks. He'll have to do it for himself. And with regard to the prohibition against making the husband's bed, Rava said, we said this only if she made the bed in front of him. But if it was not in front of him, we have no problem with it. With regard to the prohibition against pouring his cup, the Gemara comments, Shmuel's wife would change her practice toward him during her period, and pour with her left hand, since if she made some change in the manner of pouring, this would serve as a reminder of her status and mitigate the concern that it might lead to intimacy, right? If she pours with a different hand, it would be noticeable to both her and to him, and they would be reminded that, well, she still wants to take care of him, but during this time of the month, they're not going to be able to have physical relations. So even though she'll pour his cup, it's with a change in the manner so that they're both reminded that it can't lead to more later. So Abaye's wife similarly would place his cup on top of a barrel when she poured his cup. Rava's wife would place it on his pillow, and Rav Papa's wife would place it on a bench to create a change, so they're always reminded that it can't lead to physical intimacy later. Apropos statements by Rav Yitzhak Bar Chananya, the Gemara cites other statements in his name, a typical tool for making a digression in the Talmud, that once we've learned the teaching of a particular sage, we might hear some other teachings that sage also shared, and now we're off subject, right? Once we're just learning other teachings of a particular sage, it probably will have nothing to do with the subject matter of the tractate at hand, right? So here we're just learning some teachings of Rav Yitzhak Bar Chananya. Rav Yitzhak Bar Chananya said that Rav Huna said, all foods may be withheld from before the waiter, as one who is a waiter at the meal must wait until the guests have eaten from every food, and only then may he eat, except for meat and wine, the most important parts of the meal, as these foods arouse the appetite much more, and the waiter would suffer if he could not eat them together with the other participants. Rav Chisda said this is referring only to fatty meat and aged wine, and Rava said it applies to fatty meat all year round, but aged wine only during the season of Tammuz in the summer. Due to the heat, the aroma of the wine is more pervasive at that time. Right? So the basic teaching here, it's a little bit different. This contemplates not necessarily this. It includes, but not only, the situation of a professional waiter in an inn or in a restaurant. But even in that case, right? So he's bringing you food, and if you're getting the sense that this poor guy, is like salivating, he's so hungry, and maybe the owner of the restaurant isn't going to let him eat until he's finished serving all the guests, hours later, then you, as the person dining in the restaurant, should make it your business to make sure this guy gets some of that food. Now, it's not going to be off your plate, right? So this is much more imagined kind of family-style dining. And also, more in a situation like in a summer camp or in a school, where students are acting as the waiter. You can see that there's going to be sort of an extra level of compassion for the waiter. But even without that, if you see that your waiter is like really salivating, like it's gonna, cause almost an unbearable hunger and desire for the food that he's serving that he is not allowed to touch, you should make sure that he gets something to eat, particularly with these kinds of food, sort of premium meat and wine. Now, Ravanan Bar Tachalifa said, I was once standing before Mar Shmuel, and they brought him a cooked dish of mushrooms, and if he had not given me some, I would have been endangered due to the craving that I suffered. We actually have a note here that, obviously it sounds like a little extreme that somebody, just because they're so hungry and there's food right in front of them that they can't eat, that they're going to be endangered by it. I can understand they're going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be a bummer for them. But endangered? Says Rav Steinsaltz, it can, in rare cases, but it can actually endanger a person. That they're not allowed to eat and they're really salivating, and it started like they're sort of, the juices are flowing both in their mouths and even in their stomachs. And for some people that can lead to reflux issues and other kinds of digestive issues. It could really cause a problem. So you don't want somebody to be in that situation. And so Rav Anan Bar Tachlifa says, he was once with Mar Shmuel. So Mar Shmuel, right, so member of the house of the Exilarch, we get that from his title Mar. Which is, a sage of the royal house in the Jewish community in Babylonia, as it were, the head of the Jewish community. So they would probably eat first, right? And the students would have to wait. But Mar Shmuel must have observed that Rav Anan was having that situation and just gave him some food, so, to slake his hunger a little bit. And says also Rav Ashi, I was once standing before Rav Kahana, and they brought slices of turnip and vinegar, and if he had not given me some, I would have been endangered. And Rav Papa said, even a fragrant date should be offered to the waiter. The Gemara concludes, the principle of the matter is, one should offer some of everything that either has an aroma or has a sharp taste to whomever is present when it is served, so that no one suffer by being unable to partake of these foods. And that's a nice principle right there, right? Not just the waiter, but anyone present. It's tacky to be eating really rich food in the presence of people who, might be hungry and are not allowed to eat. Not just tacky, but cruel. So make sure you're not in that situation. It is related about two sages, Avu bar Ichi and Minyamin bar Ichi, that one of them was accustomed to give his waiter from every type of food that he ate, while the other one would give the waiter only one of the types of food that he ate. And the Gemara says, Eliyahu, meaning the prophet Elijah, spoke with this sage, but Elijah did not speak with that sage, since he did not act with piety and caused his waiter to suffer. Elijah is understood to be roaming around in the world at all times. He ascended without dying, and he sort of acts as a kind of semi-human, semi-angel. And it'll be Elijah who heralds the coming of Mashiach, the coming of the Messiah, when the Messianic age begins. And from time to time, the sages understood that people could have a conversation with Elijah. Elijah would reveal himself to certain people who merited to have a conversation with Elijah, usually great and holy sages. And so here we're being told, perhaps in the manner of an incident that happened, or perhaps a little bit more, kind of a teaching story, that somebody who gave his waiter to taste of all the foods that he himself was eating merited to speak with Elijah, and somebody who just, gave a taste of one of his foods to the waiter did not. And similarly, the Gemara relates an incident with regard to two pious men, and some say they were Rav Mari and Rav Pinchas, the sons of Rav Chisda. So one sage would give the waiter something to eat before the meal, and the other sage would give the waiter something to eat after the guests had eaten. And with regard to the one who gave it to him earlier, Elijah spoke with him. But with regard to the one who gave a bit of his food after he had finished eating, that's when he gave some of his food to the waiter, Elijah did not speak with that gentleman. So the Gemara relates another incident with regard to this matter. Amemar and Marzutra and Rav Ashi were sitting at the entrance to the house of King Izgur. And the king's chief butler was passing by with various foods. And Rav Ashi saw Marzutra's face blanch because he craved the food. Right, now here, it's not the situation that you have some very lofty sages who are getting fed before their students. Rather, we have a gathering of some very lofty sages themselves, the heads of the Jewish community in Persia, where the Babylonia, the Babylonian Jewish community was within Persia, right? Because it's called Bavel, because that's the area that they're in, but by then it was part of the Persian Empire. And so some of these sages who were the leaders of the Jewish community, especially the exilarch, the head of it, actually had collegial, warm relations, but still the relations of a subject and a king. But they had, decent relations with the king of Persia. And that's King Izgur is the king of Persia. So really one of the most powerful kings in the world, very large empire. But in that situation, the sages, did not eat at the same time as the king. The king would eat first. And this was causing a problem to Marzutra, who was used to eating early, and now he has to wait. And so Rav Ashi noticed that Amemar and Rav Ashi noticed that Rav Ashi saw that Marzutra was suffering because his mouth was starting to water in the presence of all this really amazing food that was going by, being taken to the king. So what happened? So Rav Ashi took some of the food from the king's tray with his finger, and he put it in Marzutra's mouth. The chief butler said to him, "You have spoiled the king's meal, as now he will not eat from it." The king's soldiers who were there said to him, to Rav Ashi, "Why did you do this?" Now, it's amazing they asked, "Why did you do this?" Because In a lot of ancient kingdoms, you spoil the king's meal, they might take you right to the gallows. But they asked, why did you do this? Rav Ashi said to them, the one who makes such awful dishes is the one who actually spoiled the king's food. And they said to him, why do you say this? And he said to them, I saw something else in this meat. Here, written in Rav Steinsaltz's elucidation, what he saw was a leprous infection in the meat. Well, they checked and they didn't find anything. So he took his finger and he placed it on the food and said to them, did you check right here? And they then checked that spot and they found the infection. Now the sages, so, like putting his finger in the food actually saved the king from eating something that might have made him sick. But remember, that's not why Rav Ashi put his finger in the food. He put the finger in his food to get some of it to give to his colleague Mar Zutra, who was having his own kind of distress. So was he just lucky that there was some kind of infection in the food after he said, because, otherwise he might have been executed for ruining the king's dish? The sages said to Rav Ashi, what is the reason that you relied on a miracle and assumed that leprous infection would be found in the king's food? And he said to them, to the sages, I saw a leprous spirit hovering over the food, and I realized that it had to have this defect. So he wasn't taking such a chance. He somehow knew, with the insight of a sage, that would be found. He wasn't just saying, God, please save me. I need a miracle right now, because if you don't put some kind of a little infection in that food, they're going to kill me. Rather, he had some reason to believe that. Now, the Gemara relates another incident with regard to a similar subject. A certain Roman, that would be not a Jew, said to a certain woman, presumably not a Jew, will you marry me? And she said to him, no. And in order to convince her, he went and brought pomegranates and peeled them and ate them in front of her and did not give her any of the pomegranates. This is going to convince her to marry him. Well, the aroma of the pomegranates caused her mouth to water. So she swallowed all of the saliva, and that caused her anguish. But he did not give her any until she became ill and bloated. Ultimately, the Roman said to her, if I cure you, will you marry me? And from the midst of her distress, she said, yes. And he went and brought more pomegranates and peeled them and ate them in front of her. And he said to her, all the saliva that causes you anguish, spit it out. Spit it out. And she did this until something like a green leaf came out of her, and then she was cured. Real romantic guy. That's the end of the story. The Mishna says, our Mishna about the obligations of a wife under the marriage contract. Getting back to the subject at hand, and by the way, now we're on page 61b and have been for a few lines. The Mishnah says that a wife must make thread from wool. So the Gemara infers she must make thread from wool, but she's not obligated to make thread from flax, which is a more labor-intensive thing. And the Gemara explains, whose opinion is expressed in the Mishnah. It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. As it is taught in a Baraisa, a husband may not compel his wife to stand before his father and serve him, or to stand before his son and serve him, or to place straw before his animals, i.e. horses and donkeys. But he can compel her to place straw before his cattle, i.e. cows and bulls. And Rabbi Yehuda said he also cannot compel her to make thread from flax, because flax, while it is being spun, causes the mouth to smell foul and the lips to stiffen. And the Gemara comments this applies only to Roman flax, which causes the most damage. So a lot was said there. Let's unpack that a little bit. So a wife has obligations to her husband within the marriage, right? So he can oblige her to, pour his cup and to serve him his food, but she doesn't have obligations to his father or to his son the same way she has to her husband. Likewise, she has an obligation to prepare his food, but not to do his farm work for him. So she's not going to feed his horse or his donkey. It's interesting that she might have to feed his cows, because I guess that might be just part of the process of eventually, bringing the steak to his plate. I'm not sure. That's not explained. But with regard to spinning thread from flax, it's not so much that it's more labor intensive, but doing it can cause a person to have a foul taste in his mouth or to undergo some, some physical harm. It's more risky. And therefore, that's not one of her obligations under the ketubah. So the Mishnah continues that Rabbi Eliezer says, even if she brought him 100 maidservants, right, 100 slaves who could do all her work for her, still the husband may compel her to make thread from wool. Why? Because idleness leads to licentiousness. Now, Rav Malkiyu said that Rav Ada bar Ahava said the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Right? That no matter how many slaves she brings into the marriage, or no matter how rich the couple is, the husband can obligate her to do some work herself, some menial work herself, like making thread from wool, because otherwise, she will be too idle, and that could lead to licentiousness. So Rabbi Hanina, the son of Rav Ikka, said, the law discussed in Tractate Beitza on page 28b, that a skewer that had been used for roasting meat but no longer has an olive bulk of meat on it, it may be moved to a corner on a festival. And the law with regard to maidservants that we just said. And the law discussed in Tractate Nida that if a girl has 2 hair follicles in her private parts, even if there are no hairs growing from the follicles, she is considered to have reached majority. She's now a legal adult, and she may perform chalitza in a yibum situation where she was betrothed and her husband died and he had a brother, and she doesn't want to marry the brother. She's old enough to perform the chalitza ceremony. So these 3 teachings of Rabbi Hanina, the son of Rav Ikka, the middle one of which is pertinent to what we're talking about here, that a wife, even no matter how wealthy she is or how many slaves she brings, she should still do some work. These 3 laws were all stated by this one rabbi, Rav Malkiyu. However, the law discussed in Tractate Avodah Zarah, that a Jew who cuts the hair of a pagan must stop a distance of 3 finger breadths on every side before he reaches the man's forelock, as the pagans would grow their forelocks for idolatry, and the Jew must not appear to be participating in helping the pagan, cut his hair to serve his idolatrous deity. And the law that one may not place burnt ashes on a wound because it looks like a tattoo. And the law discussed in Tractate Avodah Zarah that cheese made by a Gentile is forbidden because Gentiles smooth the surface of their cheese with lard, and that would be mixing milk and meat. These 3 laws were all stated by a different sage, not Rav Malkiyu, but rather Rav Malkiya. So all we're learning here, total digression, there are these 2 sages that have very similar names, each of which is known for transmitting 3 teachings. One of those 6 teachings is pertinent to what we're talking about here, but the Gemara is taking the opportunity to remind us of the distinction between Rav Malkiyu and Rav Malkiya. So Rav Papa said, the laws mentioned above that relate to a Mishna or a Baraisa were stated by Rav Malkiya, and the laws that are not related to a Mishnah or a Baraisa were taught by Rav Malkiyu. And your mnemonic to remember this is that the Mishnah is a queen. The Mishnah is a Malketa, indicating that the comments that are referring to a Mishnah were made by Rav Malkiya, that ends in A like Mishnah. And the Gemara asks, what is the difference between Rabbi Hanina, the son of Rav Ikka, and Rav Papa? And the Gemara answers, there's a practical difference between them with regard to the law concerning maidservants. According to Rabbi Hanina, the law was stated by Rav Malkiyu, whereas Rav Papa holds that it was taught by Rav Malkiya, since it is referring to a dispute in the Mishnah. And the final bit of commentary on Mishnah number 4, the Mishnah says that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, even one who vows that his wife is prohibited from doing any work, you can't do that, right? You can't make a vow that's going to stop your wife from doing any work. Why? Because idleness leads to licentiousness, right? So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, one who vows that his wife is prohibited from doing any work, he must divorce her. and give her the payment of her marriage contract. Why? Because idleness leads to idiocy. One who does nothing will end up being stupid. So the Gemara asks, this is essentially the same as the opinion of the first Tana, Rabbi Eliezer, who says that idleness leads to licentiousness. And the Gemara answers, well, the practical difference between Rabbi Eliezer, who says that idleness leads to licentiousness, and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who says that idleness leads to idiocy. What is the practical difference between these teachings? Is the case where the wife plays with small dogs or with games like chess. Since there is something occupying her, she is not in danger of idiocy, but occupying herself with diversions of this type may still lead to licentiousness. She's at least doing something. She won't end up being an idiot. But if she's not doing any kind of work, she might end up licentious. And that is the end of the commentary on Mishnah number 4. Here comes Mishnah number 5. With regard to one who vows that his wife may not derive benefit from marital relations with him. Right? A husband who takes a vow that his wife may not derive benefit from their having sex together. Right? In other words, he's making a vow that he will not have sex with his wife. Beis Shammai say he may maintain this situation for up to 2 weeks. But if he makes a vow that he's not going to have sex with his wife for more than 2 weeks, what's going to happen then? He must divorce her and give her the payment of her marriage contract. Beis Hillel say he must divorce her if this situation continues beyond 1 week. Apropos the husband's obligations to his wife regarding marital relations, the Gemara mentions other aspects of this issue. Students may leave their homes and travel in order to learn Torah without their wives' permission for up to 30 days. Laborers may leave their homes without their wives' permission for up to 1 week. The set interval defining the frequency of a husband's conjugal obligation to his wife, right? A wife is entitled to have sex with her husband a certain number at a certain frequency. If she doesn't want to, she doesn't have to. But if she wants to have sex, there's a minimum number of times that a husband must have sex with his wife that wants it, and that number is dependent on his profession, right? So the set interval defining the frequency of a husband's conjugal obligation to his wife is stated in the Torah, and we derive this from Exodus 21:10. So unless the couple stipulated otherwise, it varies according to the man's occupation and proximity to his home. Men of leisure, men who are so wealthy that they do not work, they must engage in marital relations every day, if that's what their wives want. Laborers must do so twice a week. Donkey drivers, once a week. Camel drivers, who are on the road a lot, they must still make themselves available once every 30 days. And sailors must make themselves available every 6 months. They should not go on voyages more than 6 months long. That would, presume sort of like Talmudic times when people weren't really taking, ship journeys, ocean journeys that were that long, because it was more like, they were going from the Middle East to, around the Mediterranean, really. They were probably aware of people shipping out in the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean, but that was very rare. If you talk about people actually doing, taking ocean voyages 2,000 years ago. Much later, when we get into the 14, 15, 1600s and the age of discovery, then this wouldn't have worked, because then routinely there were ocean voyages that were years in length, but that wasn't happening at this time. So with regard to these frequencies that I just listed, this is the statement of Rabbi Eliezer, and that's where the Mishnah concludes. Here comes the Gemara on Mishnah number 5. The Gemara asks, what is the reason that Beis Shammai say a husband may force abstinence on his wife by a vow for a period of up to 2 weeks without being compelled to divorce her? Where do they get this? So Beis Shammai derived this from the law that a woman who gave birth to a female is tameh, ritually impure, and prohibited from engaging in conjugal relations with her husband for 2 weeks after childbirth. You'll find that law at Leviticus 12:5. Now from this, they derive that a period of up to 2 weeks of abstinence is not deemed undue suffering, since it already exists in the Torah. So that's the longest period defined in the Torah of abstinence. for a married couple. So why do Beis Hillel say 1 week is the most that a husband could impose on his wife? And they derive it from a woman who gave birth to a male who is deemed who the Torah deems ritually impure for 1 week and prohibited to her husband for 1 week after giving birth to a male. So that's the longest that a husband could impose, abstinence by his own vow. Longer than that, and he would have to divorce her. So the Gemara asks, and if this is so, Beis Hillel should also derive the law from a woman who gave birth to a female, since it is clear that the Torah does at times mandate a period of abstinence longer than 1 week. So the Gemara answers, if they derived it from a woman who gave birth, this is indeed how they would have derived it. But Beis Hillel didn't take this teaching from a woman who gave birth. Rather, Beis Hillel derived it from the law with regard to a menstruating woman who is prohibited from marital relations for 7 days according to Torah law. Right? After her menses finishes, she counts 7 clean days, then immerses in the mikveh, and then they become permitted to each other again. So the Gemara explains, with regard to what do they disagree? Why does Beis Hillel end up at 1 week and Beis Shammai at 2 weeks? One sage, meaning Beis Hillel, holds that one should derive a common matter from a common matter. Consequently, they derive the laws of permitted abstinence by a husband who vowed not to engage in marital relations with his wife from the law of a menstruating woman, since both of these are common cases. And the other sage, Beis Shammai, holds that one should derive a matter that one caused, such as by making a vow, from a different matter that he caused, like childbirth, and not from menstruation, which are not caused by him at all, right? He participated in the woman coming to childbirth. He doesn't participate in he doesn't cause a woman to menstruate. The husband does not. So the Gemara asks, So Rav said the dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai concerns one who specifies the given period of time in his vow. But if he vowed not to engage in marital relations with his wife for an unspecified period of time, he just, he was angry, he took a vow, I will not have sex with you. I hereby take a vow that I will not have sex with you. And he hasn't set a time limit. I think this is just going to lead to he must divorce her immediately because he cannot do that. Either that or the vow is meaningless. I can't remember what I read before. Let's see what it is. So one who takes a vow and does not specify a period of time, right, all agree that he must divorce her immediately and give her payment for the marriage contract and not wait 1 week or 2 weeks. He now is obligated to divorce her immediately and pay her the full amount of her marriage contract. And the reason is that since he did not indicate how long he intended to keep the vow, her suffering begins immediately. And Shmuel said, even with regard to an unspecified vow, he should also wait for the same period of time, as perhaps he will find an extenuation enabling the dissolution of his vow, and then he will not need to divorce her. Now the Gemara asks, didn't they disagree about this issue once already, as we learned in a Mishna on page 70a of this tractate? In the case of one who vows that his wife is prohibited from benefiting from him or from his property, if his vow will remain in effect for up to 30 days, he must appoint a trustee to support her. But if the vow will remain in effect for more than that amount of time, he must divorce her and give her the payment of her marriage contract. And Rav said, in that situation, in that discussion, they taught this only with regard to a case where he specifies a limited amount of time during which the vow would be in effect. But if he vows without specification, he must divorce her immediately and give her the payment of her marriage contract immediately. And Shmuel said, even when he vowed without a specification, he should also wait, as perhaps he will discover an extenuation enabling the dissolution of his vow. Right? He's going to go to a sage who's going to ask him some questions, including if you had realized when you made that vow that these would be the consequences of your vow, would you have made that vow? Those are the extenuating circumstances. And if he says, no, I would never have made that vow, then the sage can dissolve his vow, can release the vow for him. But, the sage might not dissolve his vow, and until a sage dissolves his vow, he must adhere to the vow, and therefore he vowed that his wife cannot benefit from him, and the vow cannot be dissolved. He's going to have to divorce her. But at least don't do it immediately. Give it at least a little bit of time to see if they can get the vow dissolved so the marriage can continue. I'm almost done. If you have questions or comments, get them in now. The Gemara answers, it is necessary to cite the dispute in both cases, as if it were stated only with regard to this case of one who vows not to engage in marital relations. One might think that in this case, Rav says he must divorce her because there's no possibility of appointing a trustee. but that with regard to that law, in the case where he vows not to provide sustenance, which can be provided by a trustee, one would say that Rav concedes to Shmuel that he should wait. Conversely, if the dispute was stated with regard to that case where a trustee can be appointed, one might think that in that case Shmuel said to wait, but in this case of one who vows not to engage in marital relations, one might say that Shmuel concedes to Rav that he can divorce immediately. Therefore, it's necessary to cite the dispute in both cases, that in both cases they should wait to see if there's some way out of this situation, which seems to require divorce immediately. Okay. Let's see questions or comments. On page 61 here in Tractate Kesubos, Yosef says, you see all through Tanakh, all through the Hebrew Bible, that hospitality is a high value. Right here commenting on this idea that you cannot eat in front of others, even your waiter, you should be concerned that, if his mouth is salivating looking at your food, that you should give him some to eat. In fact, even Ezekiel condemns Sodom as inhospitable. Ezekiel? Are you talking about the prophet Ezekiel in the book of Ezekiel talks about Sodom? I guess you're right. I just can't remember that verse right now. But certainly, yes, the Mishna talks about Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, what was the major sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? Aside from all kinds of stuff that they practiced, like murder, it was a terrible place where somebody who was hospitable to guests of the city, right? Somebody who came in who was not a Sodomite to visit somebody who was living in Sodom, and the one who lived there, extended hospitality. The other residents of Sodom would, have that person executed because they did not want any new people coming to Sodom and Gomorrah. And that just sort of shows you the extent to which that was an evil place, right? And a big part of that teaching is their absolute lack of hospitality. Tom, if the dish was awful, why did he give any of it to Mar Zutra? Right, so what it seems like is it wasn't awful. It just had some spot within it that was bad. But the part where he took was fine. It looked and smelled great. And the part that he gave to Mar Zutra didn't do Mar Zutra any harm. But somehow he knew he was going to be able to get away with it because he saw some other spot in another part of the dish, where the sort of thing where you could have just lifted that out and the whole dish would be fine. But for a king's dish, they wouldn't do that. They would just start over. Bill, the Red Sea to India trade route was actually extremely common in the Talmudic era. Thank you. It was the source of the vast wealth of the kingdom of Aksum, which is the ancestor of the medieval empire of Ethiopia. However, the trade winds in that region would still mean that a 6-month round-trip voyage from Africa or Arabia to India would be feasible. Okay, so they had these longer trips, but they said 6 months, right? So that's what you're saying. You're agreeing with me that you could do it in 6 months, but that the multi-year trips, right, like the HMS Beagle that Darwin was on, or a few centuries earlier Magellan, right, circumnavigating the world, Columbus, those kinds of trips were much longer, right? You wouldn't get there and back in 6 months. Sam is stating that we have learned something, past tense, later in the tractate, indicative of the expectation that tractates are read multiple times and bring to memory various teachings at various times, or something else. That's interesting. Oh, right. So we have learned, right? It's like they said, we have learned. And it was referring to something that we haven't seen yet. We're on page 61, and it's going to come up on page 70. So why would they say we have learned, given that it's coming up later? So there's a couple answers to that. First of all, the real answer is this was all an oral tradition, right? It used to be that they would memorize the whole thing. So, where it gets actually laid down on paper doesn't mean that much in a memorized tradition. But also, I think you put it just right, Sam. that all the sages are constantly expected to read and review every tractate many times, right? So the fact that something occurs a little bit later it could certainly still be referred to as we have learned, even though we haven't learned in this particular linear reading of our tractate. And finally, Ifa, since abstinence causes suffering for a wife, what is the law regarding erectile dysfunction or some other cause for man unable to satisfy his wife? What a great question. So, I would say, that would be a misfortune that befalls them both. Because certainly, now what it might be is if he cannot perform at all, that would be, if she wanted to divorce him, and marry someone who could provide for her, that would be grounds for it. She could, if he refused to give the divorce, she could probably take him to court and say, look, he can't do it. I would still like to have children. And even if she's past childbearing age, she has a right to this. And if he can't provide it, yes, they could end the marriage because of that, and she could go, marry someone who could provide that. But she wouldn't be obligated to do that, and certainly the couple could treat that as a challenge that confronts both of them, in the sense that it's his physical challenge, but both of them pay a price. But that all the other elements of their marriage are more important than that, and they're not going to end their marriage because of this challenge. I would think that that's how they could choose to proceed. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 62 at the regular weekday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.